The wilderness doesn't just take lives. Sometimes it leaves behind riddles that defy the very laws of physics. Imagine a professional ranger vanishing in the woods he knew like the back of his hand. A hiker found miles away with his boots perfectly laced, but his feet missing. And a man whose clothes were found sitting on a log, completely empty, as if he had simply evaporated out of them. We are diving deep into the abnormal remains archives. We have combined 3 of the most disturbing and paradoxical disappearances ever recorded into one single chilling journey. Cases where the evidence found doesn't lead to answers, only to more darkness. Lock your doors, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself. These are the stories that the national parks can't explain, starting with the man who knew too much. Paul Fugate. In the entire history of the National Park Service, over 150 years of protecting America's wilderness, only one ranger has ever vanished and never been found. Not his body, not his uniform, not a single thread of fabric, a single bone fragment, a single piece of evidence that he ever existed at all. His name was Paul Fugate, and on January 13th, 1980, he walked out of a visitor center in southeastern Arizona into a landscape he knew better than anyone alive, and simply ceased to exist. But there's a detail about this case that has never made it into the official reports. A detail that a fellow ranger named Bill Murray has carried with him for over 4 decades. Roughly 1 month before Paul disappeared, he walked over to Murray's cabin and handed him something unexpected: an M14 automatic rifle. No explanation, no context, just the weapon, passed from one man to another, like someone settling accounts before a long journey. Murray never told the investigators about it, but he says he thinks about it all the time. What did Paul know? What was he preparing for? And why did he give away a rifle when perhaps he should have kept it? To understand what happened to Paul Fugate, you first need to understand where it happened. And the Chiricahua National Monument is not like any place you've ever been. The Chiricahua Mountains rise from the Sonoran desert floor like islands from a vast, dry ocean. Scientists call them sky islands, isolated, ranges that climb over 5,000 feet above the surrounding grasslands, creating ecosystems that exist nowhere else on Earth. The air at the base is hot, dry, filled with mesquite and cactus. But as you climb, the desert gives way to oak, to juniper, to pine forests that feel transplanted from another continent entirely. 27 million years ago, a volcano erupted here with a force 1,000 times greater than Mount St. Helens. The superheated ash fused into a rock called rhyolite tuff, and over the millennia, wind and water carved it into something that defies description. Massive stone pillars, balanced rocks that seem to defy gravity, towering hoodoos that look like the ruins of a civilization that never existed. The Apache called these mountains home for centuries. Cochise, the legendary war chief, used their labyrinthine canyons as a stronghold during his long conflict with the United States Army. If you stand at Masai Point on a clear day and look toward the Dragoon Mountains in the distance, you can see a rock formation that looks exactly like the profile of a strong Apache face, staring forever toward the horizon. Nobody carved it. It simply appeared, shaped by the same patient erosion that created everything else in this strange and ancient place. This is a landscape of secrets, of hidden canyons and sheer drops, of arroyos and barrancas that swallow sound and light. The monument covers 12,000 acres, but it feels infinite. A man could walk into these rocks and simply disappear. And that's exactly what Paul Fugate did. Paul Braxton Fugate was born on September 2nd, 1938, in Texas. He grew up with 5 siblings in a close-knit family, the kind of man who collected knowledge the way other people collect possessions. He studied biology in college, graduating in 1963, and briefly considered working at Dugway Proving Ground, a secretive Army research facility. But something about the idea didn't sit right with him. Instead, he chose the National Park Service, a life dedicated not to destruction, but to preservation, to understanding the natural world and sharing that understanding with others. He married Dodie on December 11th, 1964, and 5 months later, they moved to Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico. Then came the Navajo National Monument in Arizona, home of the ancient Betatacan cliff dwelling. But Paul had a problem. He was, by all accounts, a rebel. At 41, he had a Texas twang, blue eyes, a woolly brown beard, and a ponytail that ran to his shoulders in open defiance of his superiors. He was known to embrace a countercultural lifestyle that didn't sit well with the establishment. He chafed against the buttoned-down Park Service culture of that era. "Give 'em a bad time" was the Fugate family mantra, and Paul lived by it. His superintendent at Navajo Monument once wrote to the regional director in frustration, "If you want to look and live like a hippie, that is certainly your prerogative, but not here." He added bitterly, "I do not understand the breed now coming into the NPS." In 1970, Paul was transferred to Chiricahua, and there, among the hoodoos and the silence, he found something like home. January 13th, 1980, was a Sunday, the off-season, quiet. Paul was the only permanent staff member on duty that day. The only other person was a seasonal employee working as a clerk in the visitor center. At approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Paul told her he was going to check the nature trails leading toward Faraway Ranch, a 400-acre parcel of land that the Park Service had recently acquired. Faraway Ranch. The name itself sounds like something from a dream or a warning. Paul told the clerk that if he wasn't back by 4:30, she should close up without him. It was a casual instruction, the kind of thing a man says when he expects to return. He was wearing his green and gray Park Service uniform, the official NPS arrowhead patch on his upper shirt sleeve, a gold-colored ranger badge pinned over his heart. He walked toward the monument entrance, toward the trails he had walked 1,000 times before. He didn't take his radio. He didn't take his wallet. He didn't take the $300 in cash sitting in his cabin. He didn't take his pocket glass, the magnifying lens he used to examine plants. He didn't take any of the things a man would take if he were planning to leave his life behind. He just walked out the door, and no one ever saw him again. The search began within hours. At first, it was a standard missing person operation. Paul was experienced. He knew the terrain. Maybe he had twisted an ankle, gotten disoriented as the light faded. Searchers fanned out along the trails to Faraway Ranch, calling his name into the gathering darkness. Nothing. The next day, the operation expanded. The Cochise County Sheriff's Department joined. Then the Bureau of Land Management. Then the U.S. Forest Service. Tracking. Dogs were brought in, their noses pressed to the ground, searching for any trace of human scent. Helicopters circled overhead, Light planes flew grid patterns across the rugged terrain. 17 square miles were searched, meticulously, repeatedly. Volunteers combed the trails for years afterward, checking abandoned mines, off-trail areas, anywhere a body might have fallen or been hidden. They found nothing. No footprints. No fabric snagged on rocks or branches. No sign of a struggle. No blood. No bones. Not a single thread of his uniform. Not the arrowhead patch. Not the gold badge. It was as if Paul Fugate had walked into the rocks and been swallowed by the earth itself. But then something strange emerged. Some park employees reported seeing vehicle spin-out tracks on a primitive dirt road near Faraway Ranch. And more disturbing, there were indications of a scuffle in the dirt. Signs that something had happened, something violent. And then there was the witness. A park acquaintance told investigators that he had seen something that afternoon, around 4 p.m., roughly 2 hours after Paul left the visitor center. A dark green pickup truck with a camper shell speeding out of the monument at high velocity. And in the cab, between two men he didn't recognize, was Paul Fugate. Slumped, motionless. Investigators brought in a hypnotist to enhance the witness's memory. Under hypnosis, he described the scene in unsettling detail. Paul looked sad and dejected. The driver was in his 30s, with a Kenny Rogers-style beard, wearing a black, white, and red plaid shirt. The other man wore a green jacket. Perhaps, the witness speculated, the same green jacket Paul had worn when he left the visitor center. But there was a problem. The vehicles had passed each other at 50 miles per hour. A fleeting glimpse. A fraction of a second. Park Service officials dismissed the account. There was no corroborating evidence. No license plate number. No way to prove that the slumped figure was actually Paul. But the image lingered. A man in uniform, trapped between two strangers, being driven away from the place he loved. Sad, dejected, as if he already knew what was coming. To understand why this might have happened, you need to understand where Chiricahua sat in 1980. Cochise County shares 80 miles of border with Mexico. The Chiricahua Corridor had been a historic immigration route for undocumented farm workers for decades, but by 1980, something was changing. The corridor was being increasingly used by smugglers moving contraband across the border. Illegal activity occurred every day in the vicinity of the monument. Investigators developed a theory. Paul, wearing his ranger uniform with its gold badge glinting in the January sun, had stumbled upon something he wasn't supposed to see. A criminal operation, a smuggling route, men who couldn't afford to leave witnesses. But there was another possibility, one that some investigators found even more troubling. What if Paul hadn't stumbled onto something? What if he had been involved? What if something he was part of had gone wrong? Paul had connections that some considered questionable. The monument was remote, isolated, beyond the reach of prying eyes. Had he gotten in over his head? And then there was that rifle, the M14 he had given to Bill Murray a month before his disappearance. No explanation, no context, just a man giving away a weapon he might have needed. Did Paul know something was coming? Had he received a threat? Was he preparing for something? Or settling his affairs? In February 1981, just over a year after Paul vanished, the National Park Service made a decision that stunned his family and friends. They declared that Paul had voluntarily abandoned his post. They fired him, and they demanded that his wife Dodie return the $6,925 they had paid her during the time he was listed as missing, plus 11% interest. The regional chief detective told a reporter that he believed Paul was living somewhere healthy with someone new. Finding him, he said, was not a priority. Dodie fought back. She organized volunteer searches. She held benefit concerts. She badgered Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater until he got involved. Purported sightings trickled in from around the country. One turned out to be a mentally disabled man in New Mexico. Another was a shrimp fisherman in the Florida Keys. In 1983, someone reported seeing Paul in Bend, Oregon. None of the tips led anywhere. And then, in July 1983, a breakthrough, or what seemed like one. A Cochise County Sheriff's official announced that based on new leads, Paul had met a violent end, and that the arrest of more than one person was imminent. No one was ever arrested. No charges were ever filed. The leads, whatever they were, dissolved into the same silence that had swallowed Paul himself. In 1986, the Park Service finally commissioned a thorough review of the case. Pete Nye, one of the agency's top criminal investigators, spent a week going through every piece of paper, every witness statement, every search record. His conclusion was devastating in its simplicity. There was no evidence that Paul Fugate had walked away from his life. He had left behind his wallet, his money, his valuable gun collection, his expensive camera equipment, a truck he was restoring. He had left behind everything a man would take if he were planning to disappear. More than 8 years after his disappearance, without ever finding his body, Paul Fugate was declared dead. It is the only case of its kind in modern Park Service history. Other rangers have died in the wilderness. Some have taken years to find. But eventually, their remains surface. Eventually, the wilderness gives back what it has taken. Paul Fugate is different. The wilderness took him and kept him. Or something else did. Over the decades, investigators have chased shadows. Anonymous letters arrived, pointing fingers at inmates, at mysterious acquaintances, at a Tucson auto shop whose owner reacted strangely when questioned. A suspicious land purchase near the monument, made a month after Paul vanished, raised eyebrows but led nowhere. Tips came in about a Wisconsin man who allegedly made disturbing claims at a party about a law enforcement officer in Arizona in 1980. Nothing could be proven. Nothing could be connected. In 2014, a Park Service employee named Karen Gonzalez was violently attacked at Fairway Ranch by an alleged smuggler who had crossed the border. A reminder that the area Paul had walked into that January afternoon remained dangerous, remained lawless, remained beyond the reach of civilization. In 2018, the National Park Service announced it had discovered new information about the case. They tripled the reward to $60,000. But they never revealed what the new information was. And still, Paul Fugate has not been found. Today, the trails Paul walked are still open to the public. Thousands of visitors hike them every year, photographing the hoodoos, marveling at the balanced rocks, breathing the clean mountain air. Few of them know that somewhere along these paths, a ranger in a green and gray uniform walked into eternity. There is a small plaque at the monument now, dedicated to Paul's memory. Dodie still lives in New Mexico, in a creaky prefab on 7 acres of scrub outside Santa Fe. In her garage sits a Ford pickup with flat tires, the truck she and Paul drove home from the dealership in 1971. She never got rid of it. And somewhere, in a cabin or a garage or a forgotten drawer, Bill Murray still has that M14 rifle, the one Paul gave him a month before he vanished, the one he never told the investigators about. What did Paul know? What was he preparing for? Why did he give away a rifle when perhaps he should have kept it? The Chiricahua Mountains don't answer questions. They just stand there, patient and ancient, shaped by forces that predate humanity and will outlast it. 27 million years ago, a volcano created this landscape. The Apache used these canyons to hide from armies. And somewhere in the rocks, in the arroyos, in the barrancas, there may be an answer to what happened to Paul Fugate. Or there may not. Some questions are never answered. Some uniforms remain forever empty. If you know anything about the disappearance of Paul Fugate, the National Park Service's Investigative Services Branch can be reached at 888-653-0009. 45 years later, someone is still waiting for the phone to ring. The reward stands at $60,000. But for Dodie Fugate, for Paul's family, for the colleagues who still remember him, the reward they're looking for can't be measured in money. They just want to know what happened to the man who walked into the wilderness and never came back, the botanist who named plants and watched the stars, the rebel who gave them a bad time, the ranger who loved these mountains so much that perhaps, in the end, they kept him forever. Somewhere out there, under a sky unpolluted by city lights, the Milky Way stretches across the heavens like a river of ghosts. Paul used to set up his telescope for visitors, pointing at Saturn and Jupiter, at worlds that seemed impossibly far away. Now, he's the one who seems impossibly far away. A man who became a mystery, a name that became a question mark, the uniform that stayed empty. And the rocks remember everything, but the rocks don't talk. Paul Fugate vanished in the silence of an official uniform without leaving a single atom behind. A perfect absence. The wilderness took everything and gave nothing back. But there are cases where the forest decides to return something. Something that defies every law of physics, every logic of the human body. In the next chapter of Abnormal Remains, a man is found on an inaccessible peak. His hiking boots are laced tight, but his socks are gone. And what the rescue team saw when they reached him left them paralyzed with a fear they couldn't name. The case of James McGrogan, coming soon. It takes approximately 20 days for the Colorado Rockies to reclaim all trace of a human presence. 20 days of wind and snow and the patient, indifferent work of nature. 20 days for someone to become part of the mountain. But here's the paradox that will keep you awake tonight. When they found Dr. James McGrogan on April 3, 2014, he was still wearing his helmet. His snowboard lay nearby. His backpack contained a fully functional GPS, an avalanche beacon, and a cell phone with active reception. What he was not wearing were his boots. His splitboard boots, essential equipment for backcountry skiing, the very boots strapped to his feet when he vanished, were gone. Not beside him. Not anywhere in the surrounding area. Not scattered along some hypothetical path of descent. Not anywhere at all. To this day, those boots have never been found. This is the case of Dr. James McGrogan, a 39-year-old emergency room physician, a husband, a father of 2 young children, and the man whose final journey through the Colorado wilderness defies every law of physics, physiology, and human behavior. What happened in those 20 days between his disappearance and discovery? How did he travel 4.5 miles in the opposite direction of his destination, through snow 8 feet deep, to a location that had already been searched? And where are his boots? The mountain isn't talking, but the evidence it left behind tells a story that doesn't make sense. A story with a missing chapter. A story with no ending. James Carl McGrogan, Jim to those who knew him, was born and raised in Chesterton, Indiana, a small town just west of South Bend. His father, Bill, would later tell reporters that Jim had applied to medical school 3 times before being accepted. 3 times. Most people would have quit after the first rejection. Jim simply tried again and again until he succeeded. That's just who he was, his father said. All through school, he wanted to be a doctor. He'd help you in a heartbeat. If you were hurt, he'd be right there. That's why he's a doctor. He graduated from Chesterton High School in 1993, then completed his medical degree at Indiana University School of Medicine. He became an emergency room physician, one of the most demanding specialties in medicine, requiring split-second decisions under extreme pressure. His childhood friend, Chris Molnar, remembered him simply, "Jim always had a smile. He was always fun to be around. Hard worker, very smart. Anytime you were around him, you had fun." He paused. The biggest thing, though, was his smile. By 2014, Jim was married to Sharon, his high school sweetheart. Together, they had 2 children, ages 6 and 7. After years working as an ER doctor in Beloit, Wisconsin, Jim had recently moved his family back to his hometown to take a position at St. Joseph Regional Medical Center in Mishawaka. He was home, and he was planning a trip to Colorado. Jim's mother, Arlene, described him as always adventurous. He loved backcountry snowboarding, not the resort kind with groomed runs and ski lifts, but the kind where you earn your turns through hours of climbing. The trip to the Eisman Hut would be his first visit to that destination, and his last. The Eisman Hut sits at 11,180 feet in the Gore Range north of Vail. It's one of 34 backcountry shelters in the 10th Mountain Division hut system. The views are spectacular. The skiing is legendary. The approach is brutal. The standard winter route from Spraddle Creek covers nearly 7 miles with over 2,500 feet of elevation gain. The final stretch, what locals call the ice wall, gains 700 feet in less than a mile. Even experienced backcountry skiers describe it as one of the most challenging routes in the system. But Jim was prepared, meticulously prepared. His equipment included a split board, climbing skins, warm layers, and a helmet. In his pack, food, water, a sleeping bag, medical supplies, a GPS unit with the route preloaded, an avalanche beacon, and a fully charged cell phone. Everything a backcountry traveler could need. On the morning of Friday, March 14th, 2014, at approximately 8:30 a.m., Jim and 3 friends departed from the Spraddle Creek trailhead under clear skies. The snow depth exceeded 8 feet in some areas. They expected to reach the hut by late afternoon, Everything was perfect. The trail was well marked with blue diamonds on the trees. 4 friends heading into the mountains. 4 sets of tracks in the pristine snow. And then there were 3. At approximately 10 a.m., with the group still roughly 5 miles from the hut, they stopped to rest. What happened next depends on who you ask. According to official reports from the Eagle County Sheriff's Office, Jim decided to continue ahead while his companions rested. He told them he would meet them at the hut. But Jim's father later told reporters something different. One of the other hikers said Jim was pretty close to the group the entire time. They weren't sure how or when he got separated. One moment he was there. The next, he wasn't. This discrepancy would never be resolved. It would become the first of many questions without answers. When the 3 remaining friends arrived at the Eisenman hut at approximately 5 p.m., Jim was not there. They waited. They called out into the fading light. They retraced portions of the trail. Nothing. At 5:30 p.m., as the temperature began its nightly plunge towards 0, they contacted the Eagle County Sheriff's Office. The search began immediately. What followed was one of the most extensive search operations in the region's history, and one of the most frustrating. Over the next 5 days, 110 trained personnel combed an 18-square-mile area. Vail Mountain Rescue, the Rocky Mountain Rescue Group, the Alpine Rescue Group. The Colorado Army National Guard deployed 2 Black Hawk helicopters with thermal imaging. They logged more than 1,000 man-hours, 30 hours of helicopter time. They brought in tracking dogs. And they found nothing. That first night, searchers spotted what they believed were Jim's tracks. Hope surged through the teams. They followed the tracks through the darkness, but every set led to nothing more than another dead end. Here is what made the search so agonizing. With 8 feet of snow covering the terrain, any tracks leading off the trail should have been immediately visible. Fresh snow records, human passage like a fingerprint. If Jim had wandered off the marked route, there should have been obvious evidence. There was none. No tracks veering away from the trail. No signs of his splitboard cutting through the powder. It was as if he had simply stopped existing, as if the mountain had absorbed him completely. And the dogs found nothing. No trail leading off the main route. No scent corridor heading in any direction. The handlers were baffled. Their animals alerted on nothing. As if the man they were tracking had never walked that path. One of the most frustrating aspects, searchers said, was that they could see Vail from the search area. Civilization was visible. Help was visible. And yet Jim McGrogan had vanished completely. On Tuesday, March 18th, a winter storm forced the search to be suspended. After 5 days and more than 1,000 hours of effort, they had found nothing. The search officially became a recovery mission. The hope faded. Jim's family had traveled to Colorado to help. His wife Sharon searched alongside the rescue teams. His father Bill gave interviews, his voice heavy with the grief of uncertainty. "You just live day by day, I guess," Bill McGrogan told reporters. "You start thinking all kinds of things. Other things that you shouldn't think. Start losing hope a little bit." For 20 days, the McGrogan family waited. For 20 days, the mountains kept their secret. And then, on April 3rd, 3 local backcountry skiers changed everything. They were skiing near Booth Falls, a popular trail approximately 4.5 miles east of the Eisenman Hut route. east. In the opposite direction from where Jim should have been traveling, in terrain completely inconsistent with any logical attempt to reach the hut. In an icefall below the frozen waterfall, they found him. It was James McGrogan. He was just 1.5 miles from the Booth Falls trailhead. In clear weather, you could see Vale from where he lay. You could see help. You could see safety. But it was his condition and his equipment that would transform this tragedy into an enduring mystery. He was wearing his helmet, apparently undamaged. His backpack contained his GPS, fully functional, and his cell phone, which showed active reception. He was not wearing his coat. He was not wearing his gloves. And he was not wearing his boots. The boots, his splitboard boots, essential equipment for the terrain, were simply gone. Search teams scoured the area. They never found them. Not above the icefall. Not below. Not anywhere. To this day, those boots remain missing. On April 7th, Eagle County Coroner Kara Bettis released her findings. James McGrogan had sustained injuries, consistent with a fall. The official ruling was accidental. Case closed. Except nothing about this case is closed, because the questions, the impossible questions, remain unanswered. Consider the geography. Jim was found 4.5 miles east of the trail he was supposed to be on. Not just off the trail, in the opposite direction entirely. To reach that location, he would have had to travel 12 to 14 miles through untracked backcountry terrain, through snow 8 feet deep. For a healthy adult in optimal conditions, this would represent a full day's strenuous effort. For someone experiencing altitude sickness or hypothermia, the timeline becomes impossible. Consider the lack of tracks. In 8 feet of fresh snow, human passage leaves unmistakable evidence. There was none. No trenches through the powder. No ski tracks. Consider the search dogs, animals that had successfully located missing persons in similar terrain dozens of times. They found nothing. No trail. No direction. As if Jim had been lifted off that trail and set down somewhere else entirely. Consider the location itself. The area where Jim was found had been searched during the first days. Helicopters flew over it with thermal imaging. Ground teams moved through it. He wasn't there. Or was he? The most haunting detail remains the clothing. No coat. No gloves. No boots. The standard explanation is paradoxical undressing, a phenomenon associated with severe hypothermia. As core temperature drops, blood vessels suddenly dilate. The person experiences a sensation of burning heat. In confusion, they remove their clothing. But paradoxical undressing has a pattern. Clothing is usually found nearby, discarded in a confused state, not hidden. Jim's boots were never found. Splitboard boots require deliberate effort to remove. Unbuckling, unlacing, pulling against stiff materials. A hypothermic person might throw off a jacket, but methodically removing heavy backcountry boots, then disposing of them where they would never be found? And even if he did remove them, where are they? He was found at the bottom of an ice fall. If he removed the boots before the fall, they would be somewhere above. If after, they would be near him. They are nowhere. His helmet remained undamaged, yet he sustained significant injuries. How does an intact helmet fail to protect in a fall? The questions multiply. The answers do not come. Jim was a physician. He would have recognized the symptoms of altitude sickness. and he had a GPS with the route preloaded, with full battery power. He never used it. He never used his cell phone, despite having reception. Never activated his avalanche beacon. Never signaled for help by any means available to him. Why not? Some have suggested third-party involvement, but there was no evidence of struggle, no indication of another person's presence, and the remote location, combined with the total absence of additional tracks, makes that scenario extraordinarily unlikely. The case of James McGrogan joins a catalog of wilderness disappearances that share unsettling characteristics. Intelligent, physically fit individuals, well-equipped for the conditions, found in locations inconsistent with logical behavior, with clothing removed or missing, with search dogs unable to track their scent. Coincidence? Pattern? Or something else entirely? There is no official answer, only the ruling, accidental, and the boots that were never found. Today, the Spraddle Creek Trail still leads to the Eisman Hut. The Blue Diamonds still mark the way. Backcountry skiers still make the punishing climb. The views are still spectacular. The Booth Falls Trail is still one of the most popular hikes in the region. In summer, families photograph the 60-foot waterfall. In winter, the ice fall where Jim was found freezes into strange, beautiful formations. Most visitors have never heard of Dr. James McGrogan. His wife and children returned to Indiana. In lieu of flowers, the family requested donations to Vail Mountain Rescue Group, the organization that had spent 1,000 hours searching for the man they could not find. Jim was laid to rest in Chesterton Cemetery, home at last. But the questions he left behind remain scattered across those Colorado mountains, unanswered, unexplained, incomplete. What happened to James McGrogan on March 14th, 2014? How did a physician, a man trained to make life or death decisions under pressure, become so disoriented that he traveled miles in the wrong direction through impossible terrain? Why didn't he use any of the emergency equipment he was carrying? How did search teams fail to find him for 20 days, only for him to appear in an area that had already been searched? And where are his boots? The mountains do not answer. They never do. They simply endure, ancient and indifferent, keeping their secrets beneath the snow. James McGrogan reached a summit he never intended to climb. He ended up in a place he should never have been. And he left behind a mystery that may never be solved. But a man found without boots is not the strangest anomaly in the Wilderness Archive. Not even close. There is a case where the remains seem to separate inside the clothing itself, where the bones of the feet were found still inside the boots, while the rest of the skeleton lay somewhere else entirely, as if something had disassembled what it found, redistributed, scattered by something that understood human anatomy. The mystery of Charles McCullar, the final chapter of Abnormal Remains. The forest doesn't forget. It simply rearranges. And sometimes what it leaves behind is worse than what it takes. It takes approximately 18 months for the wilderness to erase all trace of a person. 18 months of snow and thaw, of silence and forgetting, of the slow, patient work of nature, reclaiming what was once human. But what happened to Charles McCullar at Crater Lake defies everything we understand about that process. On October 18th, 1976, a park ranger lifted a VW key from a weathered backpack and overlaid it against a photocopy kept in the missing persons file. The two rangers watching him would later describe an electric charge passing through the room as the key made a perfect fit. They had found Charles McCullar, or rather, they had found what was left of him. What the search party discovered that afternoon, scattered across a steep embankment 4 miles from the nearest road, would haunt investigators for decades. Fragments of what had once been a young man, pieces of clothing, and something else. Something that one ranger would later describe in terms so unsettling that researchers have debated its meaning ever since. The ranger who found him gave McCullar a name that would echo through decades of research: the vanishing photographer of Crater Lake. And what that phrase actually refers to is something we'll return to later in this account. In January of 1975, Charles Wesley McCullar was 19 years old. A photographer from Alexandria, Virginia, with a dream that would be familiar to anyone who has ever felt the pull of the American wilderness. He wanted to visit every national park in the country and capture each one through his lens. He had been traveling cross-country for weeks, visiting friends in Michigan, Arizona, and California, making his way slowly westward with his camera equipment and an optimism that seemed boundless. His family would later describe him as the type of person who always kept in touch, who always had a plan, who always let someone know where he would be. On January 29, 1975, Charles was staying with a female classmate in Eugene, Oregon. While she attended her college classes, he announced his intention to take a 2-day trip to Crater Lake National Park. He wanted to photograph the lake in winter, when the caldera would be draped in snow, when the water would glow that impossible, otherworldly blue against the white. For a photographer, Crater Lake in winter would be irresistible. The lake sits in a collapsed volcanic crater, nearly 2,000 feet deep, so clear and still that it acts like a mirror reflecting the sky. In summer, tourists crowd the rim, pointing cameras at the obvious beauty. But in winter, the park empties. The silence becomes absolute, and the contrast between the blue water and the white snow creates images that seem to belong to another planet entirely. Charles understood this. A winter photograph of Crater Lake would be something special, something most photographers never bothered to capture because the conditions were too harsh, the access too difficult. He told his friend he would return by January 31st, and he gave her specific instructions. If he wasn't back by February 1st, report him missing. It was a responsible thing to do, the kind of precaution a careful person takes before venturing into the wilderness alone in winter in one of the snowiest places in North America. What Charles may not have fully understood was just how extreme the conditions at Crater Lake had become. The previous 2 weeks had delivered over 5 feet of fresh snow. Cross-country skiers who ventured into the park reported that even with skis, they were sinking up to their waists in powder so soft and deep, it was like trying to walk through frozen clouds. Snow depths ranged from 2 feet at lower elevations to nearly the 8 feet at the rim. The north entrance road was closed. The rim road was impassable except in the immediate vicinity of Rim Village. And Charles McCullar had no skis, no snowshoes. His only shelter was a plastic sheet. Charles took a Greyhound bus from Eugene toward the park, a journey of approximately 126 miles through the Cascade Range. The last confirmed sighting of him alive came on January 30th, at the Dry Creek store on Route 138 near Diamond Lake. Witnesses remembered a young man matching his description, friendly, eager, carrying camera equipment. At some point that day, a park ranger gave a ride to a young man matching Charles's description, driving him from the Diamond Lake area to the Crater Lake entrance. Why the ranger allowed him to continue on foot in those conditions remains unclear. Perhaps Charles seemed confident. Perhaps the ranger assumed he knew what he was doing. Perhaps it simply wasn't the ranger's place to stop a determined young man from making his own choices. Whatever the reason, Charles McCullar walked into Crater Lake National Park that afternoon. Into snow that was waist deep, even for people wearing skis. And no one ever saw him again. February 1st, 1975. Charles did not return. His friend in Eugene waited one more day, just as he had instructed, then contacted the authorities. Within hours, Crater Lake National Park initiated search operations. But the wilderness does not cooperate with human urgency. Shortly after Charles's arrival at the park, another 34 inches of snow fell, blanketing any tracks he might have left, burying any traces of his passage beneath a white shroud that would not lift for months. Aerial searches were launched, but from above, the park was an endless expanse of white on white ground. Searches were attempted, but the snow was simply too deep, too unstable, too dangerous for teams to effectively penetrate the backcountry. Posters were distributed. Public alerts were issued. Weeks passed with no trace of the young photographer. Charles McCullar's father flew to Oregon twice that spring. He spent much of the summer of 1975 camped at various locations within the park, personally searching the northern sector where his son was believed to have entered. Park personnel and Youth Conservation Corps volunteers conducted a thorough grid search along the north entrance road. They walked shoulder to shoulder through terrain that was slowly revealing itself as the snow retreated. They checked every depression, every cluster of trees, every place where someone might have taken shelter. They found nothing. As the months stretched on, hope faded, but never entirely died. Several uncashed traveler's checks in Charles's name were never cashed anywhere in the country. $100 his father had sent to him in Yuma, Arizona weeks before his disappearance was never picked up. These small details haunted the family. Charles had always been responsible with money. He would not have simply abandoned funds that were waiting for him. The money sat waiting. The family sat waiting. And Crater Lake kept its secrets beneath the snow, beneath the ice, beneath the silence that had swallowed a 19-year-old photographer without leaving a single trace. October 13th, 1976. 20 months after Charles McCullar vanished. Two hikers from Texas were making their way along the Pacific Crest Trail in a remote section of the park when they stumbled upon a badly weathered backpack and a set of keys lying near Bybee Creek, a tributary of the Rogue River that cuts through some of the most inaccessible terrain in the park. They assumed someone had simply lost their belongings. They collected the items and, the following day, turned them over to the chief ranger. When the ranger overlaid one of the keys against the photocopied key from the McCullar file, the match was exact. On October 18th, a horse patrol led by Rangers Marion Jack and Dave Lang set out for the Bybee Creek drainage. At 1:30 in the afternoon, the radio call came through to park headquarters. 3 words that would close one chapter and open another, far more perplexing one. We have found him. The site was located approximately 5 to 6 miles by trail from Rim Drive, roughly 1,000 feet below the outer rim of Crater Lake. It was on the opposite bank of a steep embankment that dropped away at a 60% slope for more than 200 yards. The closest road was a Forest Service logging road 4 miles away. This was wilderness in the truest sense of the word, primordial, indifferent, unchanged by the small dramas of human tragedy. Chief Ranger Dan Shawley, who had joined the park just months after McCullar's disappearance, described what they found with careful precision. Evidence that Charles had been there, scattered over and down the steep bank. What remained had been dispersed by weather and time, distributed across the terrain in a pattern that spoke of months of exposure to the elements. Camping gear, weathered fragments of clothing, the backpack and keys the hikers had found, personal effects that investigators would later catalog and document. But there was something else, something that Ranger Marion Jack would later describe in an interview that has since become well known among researchers of unexplained disappearances. Something that did not fit neatly into the standard narrative of a man who simply became lost in the wilderness. And this is where we must address the detail I mentioned at the beginning. According to accounts attributed to the rangers who recovered what remained, they found something that defied easy explanation. Clothing that was still intact, still in position, as if whoever had worn it had simply vanished from within. The fabric remained, but what had filled it was gone. It was this strange detail that gave McCullar his enigmatic reputation among researchers. Now, I must be clear about something. This specific detail does not appear in the official FBI reports or the correspondence sent to Senator William L. Scott, who investigated the case at the family's request. The official records describe only scattered fragments and weathered personal effects. Researcher Michael C. Bouchard, who wrote a book-length investigation of the case using previously unreleased documents, has dismissed the more sensational claims as later inventions. Additions made to make an already mysterious story sound even stranger. But the Rangers were there, Marion Jack was there, and the questions persisted. Whether or not the specific details are accurate, one thing remained undeniable. Charles McCullar was found in a location that seemed impossible for him to have reached. Consider the geography. The Bybee Creek drainage is approximately 14 miles from the north entrance, where Charles was last seen. 14 miles through terrain that was, at the time of his disappearance, buried under 105 inches of new snow. Charles had no skis, no snowshoes. His only equipment was a camera, a plastic sheet, and whatever supplies he carried in his pack. How did a 19-year-old, unprepared for winter conditions, traverse 14 miles through snow that was sinking experienced skiers to their waists? Chief Ranger Shawley called it a mystery. The FBI was called in to complete the investigation. Oregon State Police Crime Lab examiners flew in by helicopter to examine the site. Their conclusion? McCullar had likely become lost while attempting to hike to park headquarters. With 100 inches of snow on the ground, Bybee Creek would have been completely hidden beneath the white surface. He probably crossed the creek on top of the snow and fell through into a crevice where he perished from exposure. The official conclusion was natural causes. There was no evidence of anything other than exposure to the elements, an accident in the wilderness. Case closed. Except, not everyone was satisfied with that conclusion. Charles McCullar's father remained convinced until his passing that something more had happened to his son. The evidence to him pointed in a different direction. Charles's expensive camera equipment was never found. His money was never recovered. The traveler's checks were never cashed. In correspondence with the FBI and Senator Scott, McCullar's father theorized that his son had encountered someone in the wilderness, that his belongings had been taken. The investigators found no evidence to support this theory. No signs of any encounter. No witnesses. Nothing to suggest anything other than a wilderness accident. But the questions remained. How did he get there? Why would a photographer heading for the scenic rim end up in one of the most remote drainages in the park, miles from any viewpoint worth photographing? And then there is the detail that transforms this case from tragedy to something closer to pattern. In 2006, evidence of another missing person was discovered in the same remote Bybee Creek area. After investigation, the discovery was confirmed to be connected to Glenn Allen Mackey, a 33-year-old California man whose vehicle had been found abandoned at the Rim Village parking lot in October 1991. Mackey's driver's license, keys, passport, cash, and toiletries were all in his car. But no trace of Mackey himself was ever found, until a firefighter stumbled upon evidence of his presence in the same drainage where Charles McCullar had been discovered 30 years earlier. Two men, decades apart, both ending up in the same remote location. Coincidence is an easy word to use, but Bybee Creek is a long stretch of water, and the wilderness is vast. The odds of two unrelated missing persons cases terminating in the same obscure drainage are worth considering. Let us examine what we know with certainty. Charles McCullar walked into Crater Lake National Park on January 30th, 1975, with inadequate equipment for winter conditions. He vanished. 20 months later, evidence of his fate was found in a location approximately 14 miles from his last known position, in terrain that should have been nearly impossible to traverse. The official explanation is exposure to the elements. He became lost, fell through the snow into a crevice above Bybee Creek, and succumbed to the cold. This explanation is plausible. It is the simplest answer. And in cases where the wilderness is involved, the simplest answer is usually correct. But it does not explain how he covered the distance. It does not explain why his camera was never found. It does not explain why, 30 years later, another man would end up in the same place. Some researchers have suggested that the topography itself funnels lost hikers toward Bybee Creek, that the landscape creates a natural drainage toward that specific location. When disoriented in heavy snow, people tend to follow downhill paths, seeking lower elevations where the cold might be less severe. Bybee Creek sits in a depression that could naturally attract confused travelers moving through the wilderness. This is possible. Others have suggested that the creek itself represents some kind of hazard, a place where the terrain is unstable, where snow bridges form over running water and collapse under human weight, trapping people in icy crevices from which there is no escape. The official theory suggests this is exactly what happened to Charles. This too is possible. And some have suggested that there are things in the wilderness we do not understand, patterns we cannot explain, forces that operate beyond the reach of investigation. I will not tell you what to believe. I will only tell you what was found. Today, Crater Lake National Park receives over 500,000 visitors each year. They come to see the deepest lake in America, the water that glows with a blue so pure it seems to belong to another world. They photograph the rim, the islands, the snow that lingers into summer. Very few of them venture into the Bybee Creek drainage. The Pacific Crest Trail passes through the area, and hikers still walk those paths, taking photographs, making memories, returning home to tell stories of beauty and solitude. Most of them have never heard of Charles McCullar. Most of them have never heard of Glenn Allen Mackey. The park does not advertise its mysteries. It does not erect markers at the places where people vanished. It simply continues to exist, as it has existed for thousands of years, since the volcano collapsed and the caldera filled with rain. The trees do not speak of what they have witnessed. The snow does not confess its secrets. The creek runs on, feeding into the Rogue River, carrying water toward the sea. And somewhere in the files of the National Park Service, in the correspondence with the FBI, in the faded memories of rangers who have long since retired, the name Charles McCullar persists. The vanishing photographer of Crater Lake, the young man who walked into the snow and never came out. What happened to Charles McCullar at Crater Lake suggests that in these wild places, the laws of distance and time operate differently than we expect. 14 miles through waist-deep snow. No skis. No snowshoes. No logical explanation for how he reached that final resting place. 3 grown men. 3 impossible puzzles. But if you think the wilderness is cruel to adults, wait until you see what happens when it targets the innocent. 3 children, gone in 5 seconds. Click the video on your screen. I'll see you there.